There is a world out there, somewhere past the edge of a map that no cartographer ever fully finished drawing. A world where the sky carries meaning, where the ground remembers everything you have ever asked of it, where the fire burning in the hearth of a palace knows the difference between rage and love, and where the ocean is not just water but a living intelligence old enough to remember the day the moon first looked down at its reflection and decided to stay. You have been there before. You know this world. You have walked its streets in the dark of a childhood bedroom, on the edge of sleep, when the television was still warm and the music was still playing, and the world felt, for just a moment, like it might be endless. You have followed a 12-year-old boy through a war he was not supposed to survive and a century he was not supposed to miss. You have felt what it is like to stand on the back of a flying sky bison above a world that is quietly breaking and understand, without anyone explaining it to you, that the person riding that bison is the only thing keeping it from breaking completely. Tonight we go back, but not to the parts you remember. Not to the water-bending scroll or the cabbage merchant or the moment the walls of Ba Sing Se finally came down the way they were always going to come down. Tonight we go to the places the show kept quiet. The things it buried in the margins of its own mythology, tucked behind stone walls and sealed inside spirit libraries and hidden at the bottom of a century of silence. The mysteries, the questions that the show planted in the chest of everyone who watched it, and left there still growing. Still reaching for an answer that never quite came. The Avatar world is not a place that explains itself. That is part of what makes it feel real, in the way that only things built with genuine depth feel real. Real worlds do not come with attached explanations. You do not walk into a room in real life and have the room narrate its own history at you. You pick up objects and wonder about them. You hear phrases whose origins you cannot trace. You notice that something in the corner has always been there, and you have never thought to ask what it is or why it is placed the way it is. The Avatar world operates the same way. It gives you enough to follow the story. It gives you considerably more than enough to live in it, if you are the kind of person who lives in things. And the difference between those two quantities, the space between what the story requires and what the world contains, is where the mysteries live. Some of these answers have arrived in the years since the original show ended. In graphic novels and companion games and lore books that the creators wrote carefully, knowing who would find them, and what those people would do with the information. Some of the answers are still out there, still waiting, still patient in the way that very old things are patient when they have learned that time is not a pressure but a medium. And some of the questions are the kind that were always meant to remain open, because a world without unanswered questions is not a world you can keep going back to. It is a world you visit once and then close. This one stays open. So let the room go quiet around you. Let whatever has been occupying your attention today find a place to settle that is not the inside of your skull. Let your breathing slow into the long rhythm that comes when you have decided, consciously or not, that it is safe to let your guard down. The show we are going back to tonight was always designed, in part, to be received this way, in the quiet, in the half-dark, with enough of your attention to follow the voice and enough of your relaxation to let the story do its work below the level of active thought. We begin at the beginning, which is always the most mysterious place of all. Part 1. The Frozen Boy and the Century He Lost. The iceberg glows blue. Not the pale, ambient blue of reflected moonlight off polar ice, not the blue of sky caught in crystal. This is something different, something with intention behind it. A concentrated, pulsing blue, the color of purpose, of power that has been burning for so long it has forgotten what it means to rest. You see it from the surface of the water, from a small boat rowed by two teenagers who have no idea what they are rowing toward. The light breathes, it pulses, and then Katara reaches out with her waterbending, a small, unpolished motion she has practiced 100 times with unpromising results, and the world cracks open. What emerges from that ice is a 12-year-old boy who should not exist. Not because his presence defies physics, though the physics of his survival are genuinely worth examining. He should not exist because of what he was carrying when the ice closed around him, and because of what carried him through the 100 years that followed. Because Aang did not simply freeze in the way that freezing is usually understood. Freezing implies stillness, stasis, a kind of pause in which nothing happens. What Aang did was not a pause, it was an act. A desperate, half-conscious act performed by a 12-year-old child in the middle of a storm, so violent it was pulling his sky bison beneath the surface of the Southern Ocean, and the act he performed was not merely survival. He bent himself into the ice, And when he did, he was already in the avatar state. Think about what that means. Hold it for a moment, because the show introduces it in the first few minutes and then lets it go without dwelling on what it implies. The avatar state is the accumulated power of every avatar who ever lived, channeled through a single body. Roku, Kyoshi, Kuruk, Yangchen, and every predecessor before them, all the way back to Wan, the first human being who ever carried Rava inside himself and bore the weight of keeping the world from tearing itself apart. When the avatar state activates, it is not simply a power boost in the way that a second cup of tea makes you more alert. It is the entire avatar cycle becoming present in one person, simultaneously. Every hard-won lesson, every moment of grief transformed into wisdom, every technique mastered over thousands of years of deaths and rebirths, all of it, compressed into one 12-year-old boy who was terrified and alone and freezing to death in a polar sea. That state did not deactivate when the ice formed. It kept running. For 100 years. This is the question the show plants in its very first episode and never fully answers. It raises the visual, commits to it, and then moves on, trusting that the image will do its work in the part of the brain that processes story below the level of language. What does it cost a person to burn that bright, for that long, in the dark? What remains of a 12-year-old when that 12-year-old has been the focal point of the entire avatar cycle's power for a century? When the accumulated grief and wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes has been running through a body too young to have processed its own grief, let alone anyone else's? The glow of the iceberg is the avatar state. That blue light that Katara and Sokka can see from the surface, that pulses and breathes and draws them toward it like something being communicated rather than emitted. That is Aang in the avatar state, continuously active, continuously burning for a full century. 100 winters. 100 cycles of the moon that waterbenders draw from, while the world above the ice was being unmade by fire. While Katara's grandmother was young, while Zuko's father was still an infant, and his grandfather was still a general, and his great-great-grandfather was still alive, still sitting with the guilt of what he had done, still searching the world for the airbender he had failed to kill. While all of it was happening, the blue light burned. There is something in that image that the show never stops to name, never holds still long enough for you to look at directly, and it is this. Aang spent 100 years being sustained by the very thing that had become his greatest burden. The avatar state. The responsibility he had tried to run from. The destiny he had dragged his feet toward for his entire young life at the Southern Air Temple. When the storm came and the cold came and there was nothing left to do but survive, it was the avatar state that stepped in. Not his choice, not his training. The accumulated wisdom and power of every avatar who came before him, catching a child in the dark and holding him there until someone came looking. And someone always comes. What is harder to sit with is what Aang could not have known from inside the ice. He could not have known that his absence had made things worse in ways that his eventual return could only barely address. The avatar cycle was not simply interrupted. The entire spiritual mechanism by which the world maintained its balance had been severed, and the world had gone on bleeding for 100 years from a wound that only the avatar could close, which meant the wound stayed open, which meant every death and every raid and every family broken by a century of war was also, in some impossible and unfair sense, the consequence of a boy who had needed to run from something that was too large for him. He could not have saved them. A 12-year-old cannot hold a war. But the show is wise enough to understand that the math of guilt does not operate on the reasonable terms that adults construct when they are trying to be fair to themselves. Aang knows that he was gone. He knows what was lost while he was absent, and the show gives him no clean resolution of that knowledge, no scene in which he is formally absolved, because the kind of loss he carries is not the kind that absolution reaches. What the show gives him instead is motion. He moves, he spins. He finds joy in the width of the sky and the warmth of a flying bison and the way laughter sounds when Sokka is being ridiculous about something. He finds joy with the deliberate ferocity of someone who understands, at some level below articulation, that joy is not denial in this case. It is insistence. The world is still here. There are still things worth waking up for. And the boy in the ice woke up. There is a detail easy to miss that the show embeds in its very first episode as quietly as it embeds everything that matters. When Katara's waterbending cracks the ice and the iceberg opens, the avatar state deactivates. Aang's eyes stop glowing. For the first time in 100 years, the accumulated power of the Avatar cycle releases its breath and returns to the background hum that it maintains in the absence of crisis. And what is left, standing blinking in the Antarctic light, is just a kid who has been asleep for a very long time and woke up to find that everyone he knew was gone. The show begins exactly there. Not with power, with a child waking up. There is something deeply important in this framing that the show never underlines but never abandons either. Aang is the Avatar. The Avatar is, by every measure that the world applies to the title, one of the most powerful beings in existence. And the show's opening image of him, the image it chooses to begin with, is not power. It is confusion and cold and the specific quality of blinking that a person does when the light is too bright and they are not sure yet which century they are in. The show will give him his power. It will give him the training and the battles and the moments where the eyes go white, and the accumulated weight of every avatar who ever lived moves through his body and does things that a 12-year-old could not do on his own. But it always comes back to the boy. To the kid who is still, underneath everything the Avatar state represents, the specific child who ran away from his destiny in a storm and landed in the wrong era. That specificity is not incidental. It is the engine. The Avatar is most effective when Aang is most himself, not when he is channeling Roku's authority or Kyoshi's ruthlessness or the combined gravitas of 10,000 years of previous avatars. When he is specifically, recognizably, irreducibly Aang, the 12-year-old boy who wants everyone to get along and finds joy in stupid things and believes, with a sincerity that the world keeps trying and failing to knock out of him, that the living are always worth more than the principle. Everything after the iceberg is the work of figuring out what to do about that, about how to be both things at once, about how to carry the weight of a world without letting it press the person flat. The answer the show arrives at, 3 seasons later, is that you do not choose between the weight and the person. You let the weight shape the person rather than replace them, and then the person lifts the weight in the specific way that only that person, in that body, with those specific friends, and that specific sky bison, and that specific incapacity to stop believing in things, could lift it. There is no other way it could have worked. There was no other avatar for this moment, which means the 100 years in the ice were not wasted. They preserved the exact thing that the world needed, intact, uncorrupted by the gradual erosion that a century of watching everything fall apart might have produced. The boy who came out of the ice was still the boy who went in, joy and all. And joy, in a world that had spent 100 years teaching itself to believe that the only power worth having was the power to destroy, turned out to be exactly the power that was missing. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are and what time it is where you are sitting. There is something genuinely moving about knowing that this is reaching people in different time zones, different seasons, different parts of the long stretch of whatever year it is for you right now. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do. It takes a few seconds, it is completely free, and it is the single most useful thing you can do to keep this kind of content coming. Now, we go deeper. Part 2. Ko the Face Stealer. A horror older than the nations. There is a spirit in this world who has been collecting faces since before the nations existed. Not masks, not images, not art. Faces, the actual living faces of the beings who came before him, pulled from their owners by the terrible mechanism of a single rule. Show emotion in my presence, and it belongs to me. His collection, if you trust the oldest lore connected to the show, numbers in the millions. He has been operating since time began, accumulating features with the patient industry of something that has never been in a hurry because nothing has ever moved fast enough to escape him. He wears them, cycling through them, showing you the face of someone long dead or still living while he speaks to you in a conversational, almost collegial tone, the way a creature speaks when it has been watching your species long enough to have learned to sound like you. His name is Ko. The name itself is a transliteration from the Japanese word kao, which means face. He is, on the most literal level possible, the face, the keeper of them, the archivist of human and spirit features in a collection that is simultaneously trophy and food and company, and something that the show eventually, through its graphic novels, reveals to be grief expressed in the only way this particular being knows how to express it. When Aang meets him in the Book 1 finale, in the spirit world, there is a scene that even 20-odd years on from its original broadcast sits in the memory in a way that is difficult to categorize. Not quite a nightmare, more like the residue of one. The cave? The centipede body that moves with a fluency that should not be possible given its size and structure. The rotating faces, cycling through expressions with the rhythm of something indexing its collection in real time. The deliberate, curious, almost warmly conversational quality to an encounter that is absolutely, in the most fundamental possible way, a predator talking to prey it has already identified and is simply in no rush to take. And the one rule that makes survival possible: feel nothing, show nothing, give it nothing to lock onto. Aang survives by maintaining perfect emotional stillness through one of the most psychologically challenging encounters the show puts any character through. He sits across from something that is showing him the faces of the dead, that knows his name and his history and the specific wound in his past that it could press if it chose to. That is old enough to remember the world before the Avatar cycle and has been watching every Avatar that cycle has produced. And Aang holds still. He does not twitch. He does not react. He gets what he came for, a piece of information critical enough that he was willing to risk his face to obtain it, and he walks out of the cave with everything still attached. But the history of what Ko is and where he comes from, and why the Avatar line represents something specific and personal to him, rather than merely a recurring source of prey, requires going beyond the episode itself. It requires following the threads that the show lays out, and the graphic novels later pick up. Ko is the son of the Mother of Faces. The Mother of Faces is an ancient spirit, one of the oldest in the Avatar world's cosmology, whose domain is precisely what her name suggests. She fashions faces. She is the originator of the specific arrangements of features that each being carries through their existence, the spirit whose craft determines what you look like when you look in the water and see yourself looking back. There is something almost cosmological about this concept when you sit with it. The idea that the face is not random, that there was care involved in its creation, that some ancient intelligence looked at the configuration it was producing and made choices about what each arrangement of eyes and nose and mouth would mean for the life that carried it. The Mother of Faces had a son, and that son, according to the graphic novel The Search, has been estranged from her since time began, which in the chronology of the Avatar world means since before the Four Nations formed, before the Avatar cycle started, before any of the structures that organize the world as Aang knows it were in place. The separation is not explained in detail. The cause is not specified. What is specified is its consequence. Ko misses his mother. He has been alone for an incomprehensible span of time, separated from the being who made him. And in that aloneness he has done the thing that isolation sometimes produces in beings capable of love. He has turned the need into a project. He cannot have the face that belongs to his mother, so he takes the faces of everyone else. He surrounds himself with the features of the living and the dead and wears them in rotation in a cave at the edge of the spirit world, and the millions of stolen faces are simultaneously his collection and his grief, and the only company he keeps. This is not in the original series. It lives in the later materials, discoverable only by those who keep looking. But knowing it changes the scene in the cave, it does not make Ko less terrifying. If anything, it makes him more so, in a different register, because understanding the mechanism of a thing can make it more real rather than less. The monster that acts from pure malice is frightening. The monster that acts from grief that has curdled into something no longer recognizable as grief is the kind of frightening that stays with you after the lights come back on. There is a face cycling through Ko's collection right now. Not Ummy's specifically, though that one is in there. The face of someone who was alive not long enough ago. Someone who stood in the wrong place in the spirit world while feeling the wrong thing. Someone whose expression, in the moment before the taking, contained something that Ko recognized as the thing he was always watching for. The thing that makes faces worth having. The collection is always growing. The cave is always dim. The centipede body cycles through its expressions with the methodical regularity of something performing an inventory it has been keeping for longer than any human civilization has been keeping records. But the love story that Ko's presence destroys most visibly in the show's history is not his own. It belongs to Avatar Kuruk. Kuruk was a water tribe avatar, the one preceding Roku, which places him 3 full Avatar generations before Aang. He had the particular fortune, or perhaps misfortune, of following Avatar Yangchen, whose tenure had been so extraordinarily effective that Kuruk inherited a world with almost nothing genuinely urgent to address. Yang Chen's piece was so thorough, so multi-generational, that the balances she had worked to maintain were still holding when Karuk arrived. The hard work of avatarhood had been done by his predecessor, and what remained for him was more maintenance than crisis management. Karuk made a choice. Not a malicious choice. The choice that people with genuine talent and no immediate pressure sometimes make. He decided to enjoy himself. He traveled. He competed. He was charming in the way that certain very skilled people are charming. The way that comes from being good at things and knowing it without having been made humble by failure yet. He played sports. He made friends everywhere he went. He lived as though the avatar cycle was a background responsibility rather than a full-time wait, because for the first time in generations, it actually seemed like it might be. And then he fell in love with a woman named Umi. The show gives you only a glimpse of her face. Just a moment in the cave, when Ko cycles through his collection and slows on one face longer than the others. A woman with water tribe features and dark eyes, and something in her expression that belongs to someone who was expecting the rest of her life to be a certain way and did not understand yet that it had already been interrupted. Aang sees it. The audience sees it with him. The show trusts the image to communicate the weight without explaining the weight. Umi was Karuk's fiancée. They were to be married, and on or near their wedding day, Ko came for her. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because she had broken any compact or violated any rule. Ko came for her because she was the thing that Karuk loved most in the world. And Karuk, in his comfortable years of casual avatar work and carefree living, had allowed certain spiritual debts to accumulate, had allowed certain imbalances to quietly grow in the places he was not looking, in the corners of the spirit world that a conscientious avatar would have visited and tended, but that Karuk had left unattended because the overall situation seemed fine. Those imbalances produced angry spirits. Those angry spirits produced consequences. And Ko, who is ancient and patient and always watching, chose the most targeted possible form of consequence. He took her face on the day of her wedding. The loss destroyed something in Karuk that the show does not have room to fully describe, but that the lore pieces together from several sources. He spent the rest of his life hunting Ko through the spirit world. Every spare hour, every stretch of time not demanded by the minimum requirements of his avatar role, went into searching for a predator that is, by definition, nearly impossible to corner. He found Ko's domain eventually. He confronted him, and he discovered the second cruelty buried inside the first. He could not kill Ko, because killing Ko, even if it were possible, would mean destroying the face. Umi's face would be gone in both directions. He could neither restore her nor end the thing that had taken her without destroying the last thing that remained of her. He died younger than avatars typically die, worn down by years of spirit world warfare while neglecting the physical maintenance of his own body. The hunting of an unkillable thing had consumed him in both registers, and Ko carries her face still. Somewhere in the cave, behind all the others, Umi's expression waits in the rotation of the collection. One face among millions. The reason a man spent a lifetime searching for a door that did not open from his side. The show tells you, at the end of Aang's visit, that they will meet again. They never do. Not in the series, not in the sequel, not in any of the canonical materials that have come since. Ko's promise is one of the great unresolved threads in the entire franchise, and the question of whether that promised meeting was always going to happen and simply ran out of story, or whether it was always intended as the kind of threat a predator issues when it is comfortable with the passage of time, is itself one of the show's hidden mysteries. In the cave, in the dark, the collection cycles on. Part 3. The Library Beneath the Sand. The spirit is an owl. Not metaphorically, not in the impressionistic way that something wise and ancient gets described as owl-like, as a convenient shorthand. He is literally, actually, an enormous owl, standing 12 feet tall or more, feathered like something that has never needed to be afraid of anything, with eyes that have been reading for longer than most of the nations arrayed beneath him have been practicing agriculture. His name in full translates from Chinese as, "He who knows 10,000 things." And the 10,000 is not a ceiling. It is an opening number, the place the count starts, not where it ends. He built a library, not a modest one, not a library that fits comfortably in an afternoon of careful browsing. He built the greatest repository of knowledge that has ever existed in the Avatar world, filling it with everything that he and his agents could gather across the full breadth of history. His agents are foxes, small and ordinary looking in their surface form, roaming the mortal world in the guise of animals that nobody pays particular attention to, observing and collecting and carrying information back to the shelves. They are called knowledge seekers, and they are everywhere, and they have been everywhere for long enough that the library contains things no living human remembers, and things that the cultures that produce them no longer exist to read. The library is buried beneath the Si Wong Desert. This is not an oversight of location selection. The Si Wong Desert is the harshest environment in the Earth Kingdom, a place that kills people through heat and dehydration, and the particular grinding madness that too much sun and not enough water produces in a person who has been walking too long without finding either. It is one of the few places in the world where the sandbenders live, and they live there not because it is pleasant but because they know it in their bodies, the way you know a language that you grew up speaking without formal instruction. The desert kills outsiders. It is vast, and it shifts, and it gives no reliable landmarks. Placing the greatest collection of knowledge in the world beneath the most inhospitable terrain in the world is a statement. The owl spirit is saying, "This is here, and you may approach it, but the approach will cost you something, and you will enter on my terms." In Aang's era, finding the library requires knowing it exists in the first place, which most people do not, and then crossing the desert, which most people cannot. But this was not always the arrangement. The canonical lore established through the Avatar Legends role-playing game, which is considered part of the official canon, reveals that in earlier eras, the library was considerably more accessible. In the time of Avatar Kyoshi, centuries before Aang, scholars could reach it without the desert crossing that the later era demands. The relationship between Wan Shi Tong and the human world was warmer then, more collaborative. He liked knowledge. Humans had some. He had some that they wanted. The exchange was genuine. Then the Fire Nation happened. At some point before the events of the show, agents acting on behalf of the Fire Nation's intelligence apparatus accessed sections of the library that Wan Shi Tong had made available in good faith, extracted information that humans from many cultures had contributed to the library's collection over centuries, and used that information to prosecute the war more effectively, to kill people who might otherwise have survived, to win battles that might otherwise have gone differently. The burned and gutted wing of the library that Professor Zai mentions during Team Avatar's visit, the section where the shelves are bare and the smell of old smoke still lingers in the archival dust, that is the consequence of this operation. Whatever the Fire Nation extracted from those shelves, it cost people their lives. And Wan Shi Tong, who had spent an amount of time that the word long cannot adequately measure building this collection, closed his doors. He pulled the library deeper into the desert. He stopped inviting scholars. He let the entrance be swallowed by sand. And he installed a rule. Anyone who enters must enter in the spirit of seeking knowledge for its own sake. Anyone who uses the knowledge for harm has broken the agreement and will face the consequences of that breach. He is genuine about this rule. It is not a technicality he enforces pedantically. It is the one thing he actually cares about. He let people in because people bring knowledge, because his knowledge seekers can find only what humans produce, and the collective intelligence of humanity is genuinely interesting to an entity whose entire existence is organized around knowing things. The deal was always mutual. He gives access. Humans bring new information. And when humans broke the deal, in the specific and bloody way they broke it, the deal ended. What makes the visit in Book 2 simultaneously exciting and heartbreaking is the way Sokka's discovery operates. Finding the date of the solar eclipse, the day of Black Sun, represents everything Sokka has been trying to contribute to the group's effort. He cannot bend. He is not the Avatar. He has spent the entire first season and a half being the person who plans and improvises and holds things together in the gap between what bending can accomplish and what the situation actually requires. And here, in the greatest library that has ever existed, he finds information that only someone who thinks the way Sokka thinks would recognize as the key. Not a bending technique, not a spiritual revelation. A date, a window, a moment when the thing that has seemed invincible for 100 years would be briefly, verifiably, scientifically vulnerable. Wan Shi Tong sees the look on his face when he finds it. The owl spirit does not describe what he sees as joy exactly. What he sees is someone planning to use knowledge for harm. The rule is clear. The library begins to sink, and then Professor Zai makes his choice. Zai has been there barely any time at all. He has spent his career chasing rumors of this place, following leads that polite academic colleagues dismissed as wishful thinking, dedicating years of his life to the possibility that the greatest library in the world existed somewhere beneath the desert and might be reachable. He built his whole professional identity around the pursuit of a thing that most people told him was not real. And now he is inside it. And it is sinking back into the spirit world. And he can leave or he can stay. He stays. He sits down between the shelves and leans against the books and does not move toward the exit. He is not resigning himself to something unpleasant. He is making an affirmative choice. He is choosing this. He would rather die surrounded by the thing he spent his life looking for than live in a world where the thing no longer exists in any form he can reach. In the legend of Korra, when Jinora finds her way to the library in the spirit world and tells Wan Shi Tong that she could spend an eternity there reading, he points to a skeleton slumped against a bookshelf. The last person to say exactly that, he observes. Zay got his eternity. It was shorter than he planned for, and exactly as surrounded by knowledge as he wanted. What is harder to sit with than Zai's fate is the question of what was lost when the library sank beneath the sand. Not just the section the Fire Nation burned, though that loss is its own contained catastrophe. All of it, every scroll gathered over millennia by foxes who had been watching human civilization since before any living person can remember. Every map, every account of every discovery, every record of bending techniques that were developed and then fell out of practice. Every document about the spirit world that was written by someone who had visited it and come back with things to say. Every piece of knowledge about the early Avatar cycle, about Avatar Wan's era, about what the world looked like before the four nations organized themselves, before the boundary between the spirit world and the mortal world became a boundary rather than a gradient. All of it beyond reach, not gone. Wan Shi Tong still has it. He is still reading it. The foxes still bring him new information occasionally. But the door is closed, and there is a skeleton by the shelf to explain what happens to the people who ask him to keep it open. Somewhere under the sand of the Siwang Desert, the top of an enormous structure pokes just barely above the surface on certain windy days when the dunes shift in the right direction. And if you knew what you were looking at, you might recognize it as a tower, the highest point of a building that extends downward into the earth for a depth that the desert does not advertise. And inside it, in the dark, scrolls wait on their shelves, and a very old owl reads, and a skeleton leans against the books it never finished. Part 4. The Secret Fire Dragons, Sun Warriors, and the Lie That Built an Empire. The proclamation came from Sozin, the tradition of the dragon hunt, the practice by which a firebender who killed a dragon would be accorded a title of supreme mastery, the cultural framework that made dragon slaying not merely acceptable but prestigious, came from a fire lord who understood, or at least suspected, that the truth about dragons was more complicated than the narrative his nation needed. The claim was simple and flattering. The dragon is the ultimate test. Kill one and you have proven yourself beyond any other firebender. The power enters you. You become the master of masters. Every part of this was a lie. The dragons were not merely impressive animals. They were teachers, in the most fundamental sense. The creatures from whom humanity first learned that fire was not simply destruction. That fire was life. That fire was connection and warmth, and the sustaining force that keeps a cold universe from killing the things trying to live inside it. When the first humans learned firebending, they learned it from dragons, and what they learned was not technique. What they learned was meaning, the difference between fire as a weapon and fire as a living force, between the orange that burns with aggression and the full spectrum of color that burns with understanding is not a matter of skill level. It is a matter of what you were taught to see in the flame. The Sun Warriors understood this. They are the civilization that the modern Fire Nation descended from and then forgot, or rather, deliberately covered over with a more convenient history. The Sun Warriors built their city on an island and kept at its center a flame that the dragons had given them, the eternal flame, the first fire ever transmitted from a dragon to a human, not burned from wood, not produced by friction, given, in the specific sense of something offered and received, between two beings that understood what was being exchanged. The Sun Warriors built their entire culture around the relationship between their own fire and the dragon's fire and the sun's fire, understanding all three as expressions of the same original warmth. They performed a form called the dancing dragon, not as entertainment and not as military training, as communication. The movements of the dancing dragon, when performed correctly by someone who understood what they were doing, were not a demonstration of firebending technique. They were an introduction, a declaration of intent. They were saying, to the dragons who watched, "This is what is in me. This is the fire I am carrying. Judge it and tell me whether I am worthy to carry more." Sozin replaced this with a trophy hunt. The decree went out during his reign: kill a dragon and be elevated. The motivation he offered was power. The power that eating dragon meat would transfer to the killer. The enhanced firebending that the hunt would produce. None of it was true. What the hunt produced was the near extinction of the creatures that had taught humanity what fire actually was, and in their absence, Fire Nation firebending gradually shifted toward the only source of power that was left: anger, aggression. The hollow, burning fury of a nation that had been told conquest was civilization and had been pursuing that lie so long it no longer recognized the lie as something separate from itself. When Zuko's fire goes out in Book 3, when he joins Team Avatar and discovers that his firebending has weakened almost to nothing, the crisis is not technical. The show is careful about this. Nothing has changed about Zuko's capacity to bend. What has changed is what he was using to fuel it. For his entire life, Zuko's fire ran on shame and anger and the desperate need to prove something to a father who had decided before the evidence was in that his son was insufficient. When Zuko walks away from that source of fuel, when he makes the choice that has been building for 3 seasons, the anger goes with it, and without the anger, he has almost nothing to draw from. He and Aang go looking for the original source. The Sun Warriors, when they find them, are not extinct. They withdrew from history around the time of Avatar Roku, when the Fire Nation's expansion was clearly heading somewhere the Sun Warriors did not want to follow. They sealed their city. They concealed the entrance. They kept the eternal flame burning in its pyramid chamber and waited, as communities sometimes must, for the world outside to either change or end. The firebending masters that the Sun Warriors send Zuko and Aang to judge are Ran and Shaw, the last 2 living dragons in the world. They wind through the sky above the city in a spiral that is also a dance, 2 ancient creatures performing the form that they invented, performing it at full scale, which means at a scale that reduces 2 human beings to irrelevance. And what they show Zuko and Aang is not technique. It is not a lesson that can be recorded and repeated. It is an experience, a direct transmission, the fire of the dragon's spirits meeting the fire of 2 human spirits, and asking whether the human fire understands its own nature. Zuko's fire is changed by this encounter, not amplified, corrected. The show does not give this the drama it deserves, because the show trusts you to understand, from his subsequent fights, from the quality of the fire he produces from Book 3 onward, that something fundamental has shifted. He is not fighting from anger anymore. He is fighting from something older and warmer and considerably harder to knock out of him than fury ever was. Iroh already knew all of this. This is the piece of the puzzle that hits differently once you understand the timeline. Iroh, before the events of the show, before Lu Ten's death, before his transformation, had also come to the Sun Warriors, had also been sent to the mountain, had also stood before Ran and Shaw and been judged, and had been found worthy, which meant the Sun Warriors swore him to secrecy about the dragon's continued existence, and Iroh did what he was asked to do. He fabricated the story of slaying the last dragon. He let the world believe he had killed something he had actually been trusted with the knowledge of. He wore the title the Dragon of the West as misdirection, a reputation that covered a secret that needed to survive a 100-year war intact. He let the world think he had killed the last dragon so that no one would come looking for the ones that were still alive. This is the kind of sacrifice that the show handles without announcing itself as a sacrifice. Iroh's title, the name he is called throughout Book 1 with a mix of fear and grudging respect, is a lie he told on behalf of the 2 beings he had been trusted to protect. He wore the reputation of a dragon killer to protect the dragons. He carried the weight of being celebrated for something monstrous he did not do, in order to prevent the monsters that other people actually wanted to do. Consider this the next time you watch Iroh in Book 1, carrying his title with the gentle irony of someone who knows exactly what they are carrying and why. After the war ends, one of the 2 dragons lays an egg. The egg eventually produces a dragon named Druk, and Druk becomes the companion of Fire Lord Zuko through the early decades of his reign. The dragons are coming back. Not with ceremony, not with proclamation, with the quiet biological persistence of things that survived by being hidden and are now beginning to emerge because the world that wanted them gone is finally, slowly, becoming a world that might deserve them. Part 5. Roku and Sozin, the friendship that broke the world. Two boys are given each other's company on the same day they are told their fates. One of them will become the Avatar. The other, who had privately believed that he might be the one chosen, who had spent his young life as the strongest firebender of his generation and the crown prince of the most powerful nation in the world, now knows that he will not. He will be Fire Lord, and his best friend will be the Avatar. In most versions of this story, that would be straightforward. Two boys, two destinies, growing up side by side, each becoming what they were going to become. But the story of Roku and Sozin is not straightforward. It is the story of a friendship that lasted for most of 2 long lives and then ended in a way that broke the world it had inhabited, and the show tells it in the 3rd season with a restraint and an economy that makes it one of the most devastating episodes in the series. They grew up together in the Fire Nation capital. They were as close as brothers can be when they are not brothers. When Roku was revealed to be the Avatar, the two boys wept together, because being the Avatar meant leaving. Roku would train with masters of each element. He would travel the world. The friendship that had been the central fact of both their childhoods would have to survive distance and time and the divergent demands of 2 very different destinies. It survived, for a while. Roku became a fully realized Avatar. He married. He lived on his island. He mastered all 4 elements with the thoroughness that his people and his predecessor spirits expected. And Sozin became Fire Lord, and ruled, and was by most contemporary accounts a good one in his early years. Effective and clear-sighted, and genuinely interested in his nation's advancement. And then Sozin decided he wanted more. Not more power exactly. The desire was framed, and perhaps genuinely felt, as something more elevated than mere conquest. Sozin believed the Fire Nation had something to offer the world. He believed its advancement, its culture, its level of civilization as he understood it, was a gift that the other nations were going without. His empire project was not, in his self-conception, purely extraction. It was also export. He wanted to share what his nation had built. The problem was that sharing, in the specific way Sozin imagined it, looked identical to conquest from the perspective of anyone being shared with. Roku told him no. Not gently, firmly, clearly, as an Avatar addresses a world leader who is planning something the world cannot absorb without permanent damage. Their friendship survived this confrontation, but the warning Roku delivered came with a threat that Sozin remembered. Continue this, and I will stop you. The Avatar is not asking. The Avatar is informing. 25 years passed in which they did not speak. When they met again, they were old men. Roku's volcanic island was erupting. The destruction was catastrophic, the kind of geological event that happens rarely enough that no living person has a protocol for it, and Roku was fighting it, earthbending and waterbending and firebending, trying to contain something that the earth itself had decided to do. Sozin arrived with an army of firebenders and helped. The 2 old friends worked side by side, the way they had when they were young, in the wordless synchrony of people who know each other deeply enough to move as a unit without coordinating. They were winning. They were actually containing it. And then the volcanic gases reached Roku first. He was closer to the vents. The toxic air, which would kill a person in minutes, hit him while Sozin was still holding on. And Sozin looked at his oldest friend, struggling and weakening in the smoke, and made a calculation. He left. He flew away on his dragon. And Avatar Roku, the man who had once stood across from him in friendship, and then across from him in warning, and then across from him in a shared emergency, died in the lava and the ash of his own island, while Sozin's silhouette shrank against the sky. He did not act out of hatred. That is the part of it that the show handles with such precision. Sozin did not leave because he hated Roku. He left because he realized, in the specific moment when the outcome was still uncertain, that if Roku died here, the obstacle was gone. The one being in the world powerful enough to stop him was dying by geological accident, and all Sozin had to do was not prevent it. He had tried to stop it, initially. He had genuinely tried. And then the calculation changed. 12 years after Roku's death, Sozin used the comet. The air nomads fell. The war began. And Sozin spent the remaining years of his extraordinarily long life searching for the Avatar who had been reborn, the air nomad child he had somehow failed to kill, the little boy who had run away from his destiny before Sozin could find him. He died without finding him. And here is the quiet devastation that the show leaves in the margins of the Roku and Sozin story. The thing you have to turn the facts over and hold them to the light to see. Sozin did not forget Roku. The show implies, through the specificity of the older man's grief, that he spent his final years not just hunting the new avatar but also thinking about his old friend. That the thing he had done, the calculation he had made on the side of a volcano while Roku struggled in the ash and the gas, was not something he was able to set aside and move on from. It stayed with him, not as guilt that transformed him, not as a realization that reversed the direction of his life, just as a fact he carried, alongside everything else he carried. For the years that remained, he made the choice and he kept living with the choice. That is what the show leaves you with, and it is more disturbing in some ways than a clean narrative of villainy would be. He loved his friend. He let his friend die. And then he built the 100-Year War on the foundation of that decision. The greatest evil in the Avatar world grew from a friendship that went wrong on a volcanic island, on a day when the choice of inaction was also the choice of beginning. What the show adds to this tragedy, in the scene where Iroh tells Zuko what both of their bloodlines contain, is the observation that Zuko is the great-grandson of both men. Roku on his mother's side, Sozin on his father's. He carries both of them. The man who failed to prevent the war and the man who started it are both ancestors of the boy who ends it. The blood of the person who looked away and the blood of the person left to die in the lava run together in the same young man who is trying, in the third season of a show that has been building toward this for 60 episodes, to figure out which way to face. And Iroh tells him, with the directness that comes from having spent 3 seasons waiting for the right moment to say exactly this, that this is not a curse. It is a specific kind of responsibility that the universe has arranged for one person. A living question. Can someone contain both of these things and choose, deliberately and consciously and with full knowledge of what they are choosing between, which one to act from? The answer is yes. The show demonstrates this, not through a speech but through action, through Zuko going to the right side of the right battle at the right moment, and burning with a fire that is not orange from anger and not blue from cold mastery but something else entirely, something that the Sun Warriors would recognize, something that Ran and Shaw showed him on the mountain, something that his great-grandfather Roku understood about fire before Sozin taught the Fire Nation to forget it. The two legacies resolve into one person making one choice. But the question takes a lifetime to answer. That is why the show takes 3 seasons to get there, and why the answer, when it comes, lands with the weight that it does. Part 6. Bloodbending and the Woman Who Invented It in the Dark. The prison was designed to be impossible for waterbenders. Every detail had been thought through by people who had spent a century fighting waterbenders and learning their limits, their requirements, the conditions they needed to work with. The answer was dry. Specifically, completely, architecturally dry. A prison on a remote island in the Northern Fire Islands, surrounded by ocean water that the prisoners could sense the presence of but could never access because the construction kept them sealed from it. The humidity inside was controlled and kept minimal. The air itself was managed. The guards chained the limbs of the waterbenders before allowing them to drink, and any sign of resistance or attempt to access whatever moisture might be present was met with consequences that the official records describe, with the diplomatic understatement of bureaucratic language, as cruel retribution. Into this prison, at some point before the 40th year of the 100-Year War, came a young woman named Hama. She was the last waterbender standing in the Southern Water Tribe. Not a distinction she sought, not a title she wanted. She had spent her early adult life defending her home, alongside her fellow Southern waterbenders, against a campaign of methodical abduction that the Fire Nation had been running since the war began. The Southern Water Tribe was always going to be the easier target. The Northern Water Tribe had its walls, its military, its full waterbending culture intact. The South was smaller, more isolated, and the Fire Nation understood that you could defang it not by destroying it directly, but by removing its benders in small, targeted operations, hit-and-run raids that gave the defenders no time to organize a coherent response. One by one, the waterbenders were taken, and Hama held on, fighting, adapting, improvising new defenses and new techniques with the ingenuity of someone who understands that survival requires using what you have rather than waiting for what you wish you had. She made ice. She pulled water from the air in quantities that her predecessors would not have thought possible. She fought for each individual who was taken. And eventually, one day, she was the last one standing, and they came for her too. The guards were careful. The prison had no water. For a long time, nothing happened. She sat in her cage and felt the ocean just beyond reach, and felt the moon rise and fall, and understood that the tools she had always worked with were simply not available. And then one night, full moon, she lay in her cage and felt something she had not expected to feel. Power, not the muffled, reduced impression of waterbending with no accessible water nearby. Real power, the kind the full moon produces in every waterbender since the ocean and the moon made their ancient compact. The amplification was there, but there was nothing to bend. She lay there, feeling the amplification, feeling her ability at full capacity with nothing to direct it toward. And she thought the way people think when they have been alone long enough, that thinking is the primary activity available to them. The moon makes me stronger. Stronger means more sensitive. More sensitive means I can feel water I could not feel before. Where is the water? It was in the walls. Not in quantity, but in trace amounts, the residual moisture that stone absorbs from years of proximity to ocean air. It was in the wooden frame of her cage, in the organic material of the structure around her. It was in the small animals that shared her cell, the rats that moved through the cage in the way that small animals move when they have determined that the large creature in their space is not a threat. She started with the rats. This is stated in the episode with a matter-of-factness that is characteristic of the show's approach to its own darkest material. She practiced on the rats. She spent time, undefined but clearly substantial, working in the dark of her cell by moonlight to understand the technique she was developing by feel and repetition, and the specific intelligence of a person who has understood waterbending in her body since childhood. She was finding the water inside a living creature and learning to move it, learning to use that movement to move the creature. Learning, gradually and carefully, how to take hold of the water in the blood and muscle and soft tissue of a body and operate that body from the outside as if it were an extension of her own. She was inventing bloodbending, the technique that the show presents as the darkest, most feared, most psychologically destabilizing bending art in the world was developed alone, in a prison cell, by a woman who had been taken from her home by people who wanted to make her powerless, and who found power in the exact mechanism of her imprisonment. They had taken away all the water. But bodies are water, and if the moon is bright enough, and your sensitivity is developed enough, and you are desperate enough, water is water. The form it takes does not change what it is. She used it to walk the first guard into position to unlock her cage. She walked out of prison after years of captivity, and she kept walking, eventually settling in a Fire Nation village, where she became a keeper of a modest inn, outwardly kind, collecting the Southern Water Tribe stories and traditions she had carried in her memory through decades of imprisonment. And she used bloodbending on full moon nights to abduct Fire Nation civilians from the village and imprison them in a cave on a mountain above the town. 1 for 1, an eye for an eye. Each person she took was a measure of time she had spent in the dark being made powerless. The show does not justify this, but it also, with considerable care, does not pretend the justification is nowhere. Hama's rage is legible. What was done to her was real. The Fire Nation's raids on the Southern Water Tribe were real. The systematic dismantling of a culture's defensive capacity through the targeted abduction of its benders was a real strategy, executed over decades, and its consequences were a real community reduced from a thriving civilization to the few tents and elderly residents that Katara and Sokka grew up in. Hama carried all of that into the prison with her, and she carried it back out when she left. Katara uses bloodbending to stop her at the end of the episode, and then stands in the rain and cries. Not from guilt exactly. From the understanding that she now knows something she cannot unknow. The technique has transferred. The knowledge lives in her body whether she wants it there or not, and Hama, being dragged away in chains for the second time in her life, says with genuine satisfaction, "My work is done." After the war, Katara uses her considerable standing in the post-war world to have bloodbending formally outlawed. The practice is made illegal across all nations. This does not remove the knowledge from the people who already possess it. The knowledge of how to do something, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered. It creates an accountability structure instead, a collective statement that there are things that can be done and things that should not be done, And the distinction between those categories is worth maintaining as a matter of principle, even when the people who cross it had reasons. And even when the reasons were real. This is itself a philosophically interesting position for Katara to take, and the show, by not addressing it directly, trusts you to notice the complexity. She knows bloodbending, she has used it. She uses it again, in The Legend of Korra, in a situation where she believes the necessity justifies the use, which means she understands, in practice, that the absolute prohibition is not absolute for her. She made the law anyway. The law is for the people who would use it carelessly, or cruelly, or for the specific kind of revenge that Hama used it for. The law is a barrier between the worst uses of the technique and the people inclined toward those uses. Whether a person with Katara's level of skill should be trusted to make that distinction is a question the show leaves open by not commenting on it. Hama ends up in a Fire Nation prison, a proper one this time, a just one. To the extent that a prison designed for someone who can control the bodies of the people guarding her can be called just. The guards presumably have protocols. The protocols presumably involve being very careful about how much of their own physiology they allow to be adjacent to a waterbender who proved, decades ago, that she can find water in places no one thought to protect. The technique she invented lives on in the law that prohibits it, which is its own strange kind of immortality. Hama's name is not celebrated. Her discovery is not honored in the way that Toph's metalbending is honored. But the law that Katara wrote to contain it carries the outline of what Hama figured out in the dark, the shape of what she found in the blood of the rats and the guard. Every law against something is also a definition of that something, a description, a preservation. Hama's name is in the prohibition. The prohibition is in the law books. The law books are in the archives. The knowledge persists. Part 7. Sozin's Comet, the weapon that wore the shape of a star. Once every 100 years, something crosses the sky. Not a storm, not an eclipse. Those things arrive with context, with the atmospheric signals that experienced watchers recognize, with the warning that the natural world generally provides when it is about to do something significant. This thing arrives differently. One night the sky is normal, the stars in their positions, the darkness between them its usual depth, and then over the course of a few days, there is something new at the edge of vision, a smear of light, a tail of fire that grows brighter as the object producing it draws closer. The color is red, the specific red of the high atmosphere catching fire, and for the days that the object passes near enough to interact with the world below, the sky itself runs the color of the Fire Nation banner. This is not a coincidence, it is physics. The comet, moving through space in the elongated orbit that brings it close to the planet once per century, passes near enough to the upper atmosphere that the friction of that passage ignites cometary material. The comet becomes a secondary heat source, vast and high and pouring warmth into the atmospheric layer above the world, and firebending draws from heat sources. From the sun, from the warmth of the world itself, from the ambient thermal energy that the element of fire has always drawn upon. The comet amplifies all of it simultaneously, turning the volume on fire as a resource so high that the word powerful stops being adequate to describe what firebenders can do while it passes. The phrase the show uses is the power of 100 suns. This is not metaphor. This is their best attempt at quantification. Fire Lord Sozin knew about the comet because Avatar Roku told him. They were childhood friends. Roku learned it from his training, from his long study of the world's rhythms, and he shared it with his closest companion. The way people share things they find interesting when the relationship is strong enough that sharing feels natural. Sozin filed it away. And when Roku died, when the obstacle was removed by a combination of geological accident and calculated inaction, Sozin waited for the comet the way a military strategist waits for ideal conditions. He used it to commit genocide. The attack on the air nomads required simultaneous strikes on 4 temples at 4 corners of the world. The Fire Nation's military, however powerful, could not sustain that level of coordinated assault at their normal capacity. With the comet, they could. With the comet, every firebender in the army was amplified to a degree that made the air nomads evasive, flowing, airbending insufficient defense against the sheer volume and intensity of what was coming at them. The monks fought. The records that survive in Aang's memory, in the visions he cannot stop having, make clear that the air nomads did not simply collapse. They fought. But a community organized around peace and movement and the avoidance of force rather than its application was not equipped to absorb what a comet-amplified fire army brought against them. Sozin spent the last years of his long life, extended by the comet itself, which left traces in the bodies of those it amplified, searching for the Avatar who had somehow escaped. He died at 102 without finding him. His son Azulon continued the war. Azulon's son Ozai took it to its intended conclusion, or tried to. What Ozai planned for the returning comet was something that surpassed even Sozin's ambition in its comprehensiveness. Not conquest, not subjugation. The Earth Kingdom had resisted too long, too persistently, with too much structural stubbornness to be absorbed in the way a colony can be absorbed. The plan, as Zuko reveals to Team Avatar on Ember Island, was to use the comet's amplified firebending to burn the Earth Kingdom clear, not of its armies, of its people. The entire continental landmass, swept by fire intense enough that nothing the current Fire Nation military could produce would remain afterward. A new world, on the scorched foundation of the old one, to be resettled and rebuilt according to the Fire Nation's preferred architecture. This is the end point of what started when Sozin told his best friend about a comet. The comet arrives regardless of any human decision. That is the most important thing about it, and the thing the show understands with clarity. The universe has no opinion. The comet returns on its schedule because that is what its orbital mechanics produce, and it amplifies whoever is standing under it when it passes, and whether that amplification is used to incinerate a continent or to end the war that has been building toward that incineration depends entirely on the choices of the specific people who happen to be alive at the right time. The comet passes. The sky clears. The 100-year clock resets. In 100 years it will be back. And the world it finds when it arrives will be different from the world it left, because someone, at the last possible moment, made the right call. Part 8. The Order of the White Lotus. Iroh places the lotus tile at the center of the Pai Sho board. He does this in the first episode of the series, and he keeps doing it throughout, and for most of Book 1 it is simply character texture. This is who he is. He loves this game. He is very good at it. He talks about the lotus tile with a specific reverence that seems slightly eccentric for a game piece. He plays it with strangers. He plays it with guards. He plays it in prison with the methodical contentment of someone who has found a way to be fully present in a thing that most people would treat as killing time. And then the show begins, very quietly, to show you other people who play it the same way. A man in a small Earth Kingdom town who runs a modest establishment and who identifies Iroh from across the room, not by his face or his clothes or his reputation, but by the specific tile he places in the first move of a game. A deserter, a swordsman, a king, these people, distributed across the 4 nations with no apparent connection, no shared nationality or profession or age or visible ideology, recognize each other through a board game. The same board game, the same opening gambit, the lotus tile at the center placed just so, saying to anyone at the table who has been taught to read it, I am one of you. If you are also one of us, respond correctly, and we can speak freely. The White Lotus Gambit is both a strategy in the game of Pai Sho and a statement of identity. The Order of the White Lotus was not always an order. It started as a club in the most genuine sense, a small gathering of people who played Pai Sho at a high level and shared a philosophical disposition. Scholars, intellectuals, masters of their respective arts who had arrived, through various routes, at the conclusion that the lines drawn between the 4 nations were less important than the things that connected the people living inside those lines. These were not revolutionaries. They were people who found each other through a game and discovered that the ideas they cared about did not stop at borders. Over time, as the 100-Year War made the world more closed and more carefully divided, the club became something more. The network that already existed among White Lotus members, scattered across the world in their various ordinary-seeming occupations, became a channel for moving things that the war made dangerous to move. Information, shelter, knowledge, people. The philosophical gathering became a shadow infrastructure, still organized around the game, still identified through the gambit, but now performing a function that went well beyond philosophical discussion. Iroh, as Grand Lotus, was the head of this infrastructure during the war. And once you know this, his movement through the first 2 books makes a different kind of sense. He knows people. He is welcomed in places where a Fire Nation prince should face hostility. He can navigate the wartime geography of a world divided against itself, with an ease that seems inexplicable for a retired general who has spent the last few years at sea. He has, in the specific way that secret society membership creates, a network of trust that extends across every national boundary, maintained through a game that has been played in tea houses across the world for as long as anyone can remember. King Bumi of Omashu, member. The mad genius who waited 93 years to act because he was waiting for the right moment, who played a version of patience that makes Iroh's look hasty, is a White Lotus member. The waterbending master Paku, who initially refuses to teach Katara because of the Northern Water Tribe's rigid gender conventions, and then becomes her teacher and eventually her family member. Zhong Zhong, the deserter who fled the Fire Nation military because he could not continue teaching fire as a weapon and who lived in wilderness exile rather than comply, member. Piandao, the greatest swordsman in the Fire Nation, born to firebending parents and denied the fire, who found a different kind of mastery through pure dedicated work, member. What these people share is not where they come from. It is not their element or their skill set or their position in the hierarchy of their respective nations. What they share is a moment in their lives when they looked at the narrow story their nation was telling about itself and decided it was not the only story available, that there was a larger frame. That within that larger frame, the things that appeared to divide people were considerably less important than the things that allowed them to sit across a game board from each other and play. The revealing of the order in the finale is not dramatically prepared by the show in the way that most reveals are prepared. The White Lotus members do not announce themselves in advance. They do not gather with ceremony or give speeches or wear their membership visibly. They are simply there, in the right place at the right time, in the quantities required. Old men and masters who had spent decades being the background detail in other stories, the eccentric uncle and the stubborn king and the deserter in the woods, and the swordmaster who took on one troubled Fire Nation kid without ever explaining why, and who now arrive in force to reclaim a city from the inside while the younger, more obviously heroic members of the story are occupied with their specific assignments elsewhere. The battle for Ba Sing Se, which the White Lotus fights while Aang faces Ozai and Zuko faces Azula, is one of the most deliberately underscored sequences in the finale. The show does not linger on it. It gives you glimpses. Iroh moving through the streets of a city he has felt guilty about for decades, the siege he abandoned coming full circle in a completely different direction. Bumi, who waited 93 years in a city he could have escaped at any moment, bending the earth with the inventive, cackling joy of someone who has been saving this particular occasion for precisely as long as it needed to be saved. Zhong Zhong, who hated fire for what it had made him do, using it with the control and precision of someone who had spent years living with the paradox of his own nature and made a kind of peace with it. They do not fight with the aggressive certainty of people who believe in conquest. They fight with the settled, grounded authority of people who have been thinking about this for a very long time and have decided exactly how much force is necessary and not one stroke more. The difference is visible. The show does not point it out. It does not need to. You feel it. The philosophy that could not be contained by any single nation's borders was, in the end, what saved all of them. The lotus tile, center of the board. We were always here. We were never going away. We were just playing a very long game. Part 9. Iroh, the man who went looking for his son. The siege lasted 600 days. 600 days of sustained military pressure on the single most fortified city in the world. 600 days of supply logistics and troop rotations and the grinding attrition of a campaign that the Fire Nation's history books would eventually record as a failure, though the nature of the failure was considerably more complicated than military incompetence. For 600 days, Iroh, then still the crown prince and the presumptive heir to the Fire Lord throne, kept his forces arrayed against the walls of Ba Sing Se with the patience of someone who had convinced himself that this was the moment his destiny had been building toward. The city had never fallen, not in the entire history of the 100-Year War, not in any prior conflict. The walls were not merely high. They were a statement, an architectural insistence that Ba Sing Se intended to remain Ba Sing Se regardless of what pressured it from the outside. And Iroh, with the methodical intelligence that the show later shows you in a different context, the intelligence of someone who genuinely thinks through the things he undertakes, had committed to the siege as the culmination of everything he had been trained for. His son Lu Ten was in the army. Lu Ten was thoughtful in the way that the people who are born at the right angle to see what is happening around them are thoughtful. He had grown up in the Fire Nation with the standard Fire Nation framing of the war, the story that expansion was civilization, that the other nations would benefit from what the Fire Nation was bringing them, that the century of conflict had been a necessary growing pain on the way to a better world. But proximity to the actual experience of war had been doing what proximity to the actual experience of war always does to people who pay attention. It had been complicating the framing. He was asking questions. He was noticing the gap between the story and the reality. He did not survive long enough to complete the process of questioning. When Lu Ten died during the siege, Iroh stopped. Not strategically, not in any way that military history has a category for. He simply stopped. Stopped the siege. Ordered the retreat. 600 days of progress, of hard-fought positioning, of sacrifice by the soldiers under his command who had believed in the campaign and given everything they had to it, abandoned because the reason he had been able to tell himself this was worth doing had been removed from the equation. He had been fighting to become Fire Lord, or rather, he had been fighting because becoming Fire Lord required demonstrating the military achievement that Ba Sing Se represented, because the Fire Lord throne passed through the demonstration of military worth in Sozin's empire in a way that tied political legitimacy to the capacity for conquest, and Iroh had been performing that capacity for 600 days. Without Lu Ten, without the son he had imagined inheriting a world reshaped by that achievement, the achievement itself had lost its gravity. He could not locate the reason to continue. Not the reason that had been there on day one. Not the motivation that had sustained 600 days of pressure against a wall that had never fallen. He stopped. The Fire Nation's military historians record this as the failure of the siege. In the way that military historians tend to record things that do not fit their preferred narrative, they attribute it to strategic miscalculation, to a general who lost his nerve at the decisive moment. The closer truth, the one the show gives you in pieces, is that Iroh lost something more fundamental than his nerve. He lost the frame within which the siege had meaning. And when a thing loses its meaning, continuing it requires a kind of will that has no foundation to stand on. Ozai used the retreat to make his move. In the weeks of Iroh's grief, while his older brother was somewhere between the battlefield and wherever grief takes a person, Ozai approached their father Azulon with a proposal. A chain of events involving political maneuvering and a death that the show is careful never to fully explain, and when the sequence completed, Ozai was the Fire Lord and Iroh was no longer the Crown Prince. The show implies without stating that Iroh barely registered the loss of his title, not because he was unaware of it, because the thing he had lost was so much larger than a title that a title did not feel like a category that currently applied to him. He traveled. He went looking for Lu Ten. He went to the spirit world. This is mentioned once in the show, briefly, by Admiral Zhao, who references it in the tone of someone reporting a rumor about a person he considers to have cracked under pressure. The Avatar extras, the companion commentary that aired with the show on Nickelodeon, confirm it plainly. Iroh journeyed to the spirit world to find his son. He managed to enter it, which is not a thing that ordinary human beings can do by simply deciding to do it. The spirit world requires a form of access that most living people cannot generate through will alone, which means Iroh's ability to reach it says something about what had happened to him in the grief, about what the loss of Lu Ten had opened in him that the years of military service had not. He searched the spirit world. The search is not described. What happened there is not described. What he came back with is not cataloged in any inventory of spiritual experiences. The show simply shows you the result. A man with a different quality to his attention. A man who can see spirits when most people cannot. A man who is welcomed among the spirits in a way that even highly skilled spiritual practitioners struggle to achieve. A man whose relationship to the Fire Nation's imperial project has been so fundamentally altered that he will spend the next decade wandering the world alongside his exiled nephew, offering wisdom to the very people who are trying to dismantle what his nation built. He did not find Lu Ten. The spirit world does not deliver the thing you went looking for. It delivers something else. Something that you could not have named as a need before you arrived, and whether that something is better or worse than the thing you came for is not a question the spirit world answers. It simply gives you what it gives you and you come back different. What Iroh came back with functionally was a capacity for a different kind of seeing, not the visual kind, the other kind, the kind that allows you to look at a suffering teenager who is doing everything wrong and see, underneath the performance of rage and certainty, the person trying to find their way to something they cannot yet articulate. The kind that allows you to carry your own grief without letting it define your response to other people's grief. The kind that turns a defeated general into something the world did not know it needed. Someone who understood both the Fire Nation from the inside and the rest of the world from the ground level, who had traveled through both, who had lost what made the old frame coherent and built a new one from the materials available. His greatest military achievement was the one he chose not to complete. And Lu Ten, if the spirit world works the way the show suggests it might, found his peace somewhere in the crossing, in the place that grief eventually reaches if you let it arrive there. Iroh's later peace in the spirit world, the choice he makes at the end of his life to remain there rather than continue through the avatar cycle, carries the implication that he found something there he had been looking for since the day of the retreat from Ba Sing Se. Perhaps a face he recognized, perhaps just a particular quality of quiet that felt familiar. Part 10. Toph Beifong and the discovery nobody else could have made. There is a rule in the Avatar world that every earthbender accepts from childhood as a fact about the nature of their element. Metal cannot be bent. The reasoning is straightforward. Earthbending works on Earth, and metal is not Earth. It is a refined, processed substance that has been extracted from ore and smelted and shaped into a material that bears only a chemical relationship to its geological origin. The connection between metal and Earth is technical and historical, a matter of atomic composition and geological process, but that connection is not perceptible to earthbending, because earthbending works on a different kind of perception, a felt sense of the element rather than a molecular analysis of it. Every earthbender accepts this. King Bumi, the greatest earthbender alive at the start of Aang's era, accepts it. The masters of the Earth Kingdom's greatest academies accept it. The Sandbenders accept it. It is not a limitation that anyone is working to overcome because it is not considered a limitation that has a workaround. It is simply a fact about what earthbending can and cannot do. And then Toph Beifong is locked in a metal cage. What makes Toph's discovery of metal bending not merely impressive but specifically inevitable for her and nearly impossible for anyone else is the nature of the tool she was using to perceive the world. She is blind. She has been blind since birth, and in the absence of sight, she developed a form of earthbending-based perception called seismic sense, the ability to feel the vibrations that the Earth transmits through its surface and derive from those vibrations a complete, real-time model of everything within range. Not a vague impression, a detailed picture, specific enough to detect a person's heartbeat, specific enough to tell when someone is lying, specific enough to feel an insect walking across a stone 50 feet away. This level of sensitivity, developed through years of necessity, meant that Toph perceived Earth at a resolution that other earthbenders simply did not practice. She did not think of Earth as a category of material. She thought of it as information, constantly updating, constantly communicating, telling her through its vibrations everything she needed to know about the world around her. When she sat in the metal cage, trapped, being transported back to Gaoling by Xin Fu and Master Yu, she did not immediately know how to escape. The metal was inert to her bending in the way that it was inert to every earthbender's bending. But she had time, and she had the seismic sensitivity that no other earthbender had developed to the same degree, and she began, in the dark of the cage, to feel more carefully than she had ever needed to feel before. Metal is not pure. That is the technical foundation of what she found. Even highly refined, processed metal retains trace amounts of the minerals and impurities from its geological origin. A truly perfect metal would be a barrier. But metals in the Avatar world, in the practical form they take in cages and walls and tools, retain enough of their earthen origin that something extraordinarily sensitive can still find the thread. Toph found the thread. She found the trace amounts of unrefined earth still present in the metal, and she pulled on those traces, and the metal moved. She tore an exit in the cage. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond Toph's personal escape from a pair of bounty hunters. The show handles these implications through restraint, showing you Toph using metal bending as a fight technique in the remaining episodes of the series, and then leaving the long-term consequences for the sequel to address. But in The Legend of Korra, set 70 years after the end of the 100-Year War, the world has been utterly transformed by what a blind 12-year-old worked out in a swaying cage over a desert road. The technology of the post-war era is metal technology. The cities that rose after the war, Republic City most visibly, are built with structural metal in ways that were impossible before metal bending existed, because metal bending makes metal as workable as Earth, which means builders can shape it in real time, which means the architecture of the post-war world is fundamentally different from anything that came before. The vehicles, the infrastructure, the police force that Lin Baifeng commands in Republic City, which is Toph's daughter and who uses metal cables the way her mother used the ground. All of it traces back to a moment in a metal cage on a desert road when the world's most sensitive earthbender decided that the accepted limit was not actually a limit. Toph established the Beifong Metalbending Academy after the war. She taught others. The technique, once one person had found it, became teachable, though it remained difficult, and the percentage of earthbenders who can successfully learn it remained small. Only approximately 1 in 100 earthbenders, by the time of the Legend of Korra, can successfully bend metal. What one person discovered by necessity in impossible circumstances can be transmitted once the possibility is known. The possibility was always there. The element of earth was always in the metal. The knowledge that it was there and that someone had reached it changed what was possible for every earthbender who came after. There is something the show understands about Toph that it communicates entirely through action rather than articulation, and it is this. Her blindness was never a limitation that she overcame. It was the specific mechanism by which she arrived at the thing no sighted earthbender could have reached. The sensitivity that developed in the absence of vision, the seismic perception refined to the resolution that years of necessary reliance produce, was not a compensation for something missing. It was a different kind of seeing, one that turned out to be more capable in the specific domain of feeling for Earth in impossible materials than any amount of conventional sight could have provided. The world called her blind. The world was not wrong about the absence of sight, but the world, including her own parents who put her in a gilded cage of overprotection because they were afraid of what she could not do, was catastrophically wrong about what that absence meant for what she could do. The cage that imprisoned her literally became the mechanism of her liberation. Locked in a metal box, she found the earth inside the metal and bent it open. The metaphor is not accidental. The show knew what it was building. Part 11. Energy Bending and the Lion Turtles: The First Power. Before there were nations, before the Avatar cycle existed, before Rava and Vatu had resolved their ancient conflict into the balance that a human vessel now maintains, there were cities on the backs of living mountains. Imagine a creature so large that human civilization builds itself on its back, the way barnacles build on whaleskin. So large that its movement through the ocean creates currents that smaller creatures navigate. So old that the accumulation of time it represents makes every other form of age seem preliminary. The lion turtles are not animals in any ordinary sense. They are something closer to living geography, intelligent and patient, and possessed of a kind of power that predates the organized forms of bending that the four nations practice. In the era before the Avatar, the lion turtles were humanity's protectors. The boundary between the spirit world and the mortal world was not a boundary then. It was a gradient, a continuous overlapping in which spirits walked among humans, and the energy of the spirit world was present in the physical one, in ways that made the mortal world genuinely, practically dangerous for unprotected human beings. The lion turtles provided the protection. Humans built cities on their backs. The lion turtles moved through the ocean, keeping their inhabitants safe from the worst of what the spirit world's proximity produced. And when humans needed to leave the safety of the lion turtle's back to venture into the spirit wilds for food or resources, the lion turtle gave them something to protect themselves. It reached into the person's energy, their fundamental spiritual substance, and gave them temporary access to the element it was associated with. Not a learned skill, not something developed through practice, a direct grant, administered through the original form of energy bending. The art of reaching into another being's spiritual core and changing what is there. This was always temporary. When the person returned to the city on the lion turtle's back, the ability was withdrawn. Bending was a loan, not a gift, given and taken back in a cycle as regular as the tide. The lion turtles understood what they were administering. They understood, with the wisdom of creatures old enough to have watched the world form, that the capacity to bend elements was not something to be distributed carelessly. The arrangement changed with Avatar Wan. Wan's story, as told in the Legend of Korra, is the story of the first human being to make a different kind of deal. He was given firebending by his lion turtle and exiled with it, forced to live in the spirit wilds with the ability but without the protection of the city. He survived. He thrived, in the way that the most adaptable humans thrive, by forming relationships with the spirits around him rather than fighting them. He found Rava, the spirit of light, imprisoned by Vatu, the spirit of darkness. He made a compact with her. He became the first avatar. When Wan completed his journey, when he and Rava merged and he took on the permanent burden of maintaining the balance between the spirit world and the mortal world, the lion turtle's role changed. The avatar was now the bridge. The avatar cycle would provide what the lion turtles had provided, a living connection between the mortal world and the spiritual one, a being capable of navigating both. The lion turtles could retire from active stewardship of humanity. They did. They withdrew from human civilization. They moved to the deep ocean, to the places where human beings did not go, and they continued doing what very large, very old things do. They persisted. Their numbers dwindled. The individual lion turtles that had sustained specific human communities in Wan's era had no successors to care for. They lived out their vast lifespans without reproducing at a rate sufficient to maintain their numbers, and by Aang's era, only one remained. The last lion turtle floats in the ocean like a small continent that has not yet decided to stop moving. It has been alone for so long that a forest has grown on its back, the accumulated ecology of years of solitude, green and living in the absence of any city. It has not been approached by a human being in a very long time. It has watched the avatar cycle produce generation after generation of the kind of person it helped create, watched the bending arts develop into elaborate disciplines and philosophies, watched the world it once carried change into something it could not have anticipated. When Aang finds it in the night before the finale, he is not looking for it. He is floating in the ocean, alone, wrestling with an impossible problem: how to stop a Fire Lord without killing him. Every past avatar he has consulted has pointed toward killing as the necessary outcome. Every ethical framework he knows how to apply produces the same conclusion. The framework he was given in childhood, the air nomad ethic that life is sacred and taking it is always a last resort, is the one thing he cannot make fit with the calculus of what the situation requires. The lion turtle does not offer him a solution. It offers him a tool. Energy bending, the original art, the technique older than firebending or waterbending or either of the other disciplines. The art of reaching into a being's spiritual core and changing what is there. Aang uses it to take Ozai's firebending without taking his life, which is not a compromise between his ethics and his duty. It is a third option that the existing frameworks could not have shown him, because the existing frameworks are thousands of years old and the lion turtle is older than all of them. The lion turtle then returns to the ocean. The legend of Korra does not mention it again. Whether it is still out there, still floating in the deep, still the last representative of a kind of creature that shaped human civilization before humanity knew it was being shaped, is unknown. Whether the lion turtles can reproduce, or have produced more offspring, or are simply the last of their kind waiting out the long duration of their individual lives, is unknown. They entered the world story and then moved to its edges, and the edges are where they remain. Somewhere in the deep water, an island that is not an island carries a forest on its back and continues doing what it has always done, persisting. And the thing about the lion turtle's choice to give Aang the energy-bending knowledge is worth sitting with for a moment in its full implication. The lion turtle did not tell Aang what to do with the ability. It did not prescribe the outcome. It gave him a tool and trusted him to have the wisdom to use it correctly, which is itself an act of faith in Aang specifically, in this particular avatar in this particular moment, that is quite different from the kind of faith the lion turtles exercised in the old system of bending loans. In the old system, bending was temporary. The lion turtles gave it and took it back. They controlled the terms completely. What they gave Aang was different. Permanent knowledge, unsupervised access to the most fundamental form of bending, to be used at his discretion against a situation whose parameters the lion turtle knew because it had been watching for a very long time. This is a different kind of trust than the lion turtles had ever extended before, and Aang met it, not by doing what every other avatar had concluded was necessary, by finding the specific, unprecedented, third option application of an ancient tool that no one had thought to use this way before. By taking the oldest art in the world and applying it to a problem that had seemed to have only two solutions, neither of which he could live with. The lion turtle was right to trust him. The lesson, if there is a lesson in all of this, is not that power is available to those who seek it desperately enough. It is that the right tool for the right person at the right moment sometimes comes from the oldest, most forgotten, most deliberately obscured corner of the world's knowledge. Not from the new. From the ancient, from the thing that retreated to the deep ocean and waited for someone worthy to float alongside it and ask. Part 12. The Mysteries That Were Never Solved. There is a promise in the spirit world that was never kept. Ko the Face Stealer, standing in his cave at the end of Book 1, tells Aang as he leaves, "We will meet again." This is the last thing Aang hears from Ko in the original series. The last thing the audience hears from Ko in either the original series or its sequel. The meeting that was promised never happens. Not in 61 episodes of the original, not in the 52 of the sequel, not in any of the canonical materials that have emerged in the years since. The creators have spoken about this. They have said in interviews that Ko was intended to reappear, that the ancient spirit with his grudge against the Avatar line, and his connection to the Mother of Faces, and his position as the single most dangerous resident of the spirit world was always meant to be a thread picked up later. Later has not arrived in that form. And so Ko remains in his cave, still wearing the faces of everyone who showed emotion in his presence, still cycling through his collection with the patient certainty of something that has never needed to hurry. What would the promised meeting have looked like? The show's own logic provides some parameters. Ko cannot be defeated conventionally. He cannot be fought in the way that other antagonists are fought. Every avatar who has faced him has survived through perfect emotional stillness, not through superior bending or tactical cleverness. The Mother of Faces connection, revealed in the graphic novels, suggests that there is a relational resolution possible, something that requires understanding Ko's history and his grief, and the specific nature of the loneliness that drives his collecting. Whatever the intended meeting was, it was not a battle. It was something more complex, something that required the kind of understanding that Aang specifically, with his commitment to finding the third option, might have been positioned to offer. That story is still out there somewhere, unresolved, waiting. In a cave, behind a collection of faces that include people who died centuries before anyone reading this was born. The mystery of Azula's blue fire remains one of the most beautiful, unsolved questions the show leaves open. Blue fire burns hotter than orange fire. The show establishes this and lets it stand as a visual statement about Azula's exceptionalism and danger, which it absolutely is. But the deeper question, the one the show does not address, is what blue fire means at the level of bending philosophy. The 100-Year War, according to the Sun Warriors and the surviving tradition they preserve, had corrupted Fire Nation firebending. The connection to fire as a living force, as something with warmth and meaning and a relationship to the light that makes it, had been replaced over a century of war by the simpler, dirtier fuel of anger and aggression. Most Fire Nation firebenders in the show bend with orange fire because they are bending with a corrupted understanding of what fire is. Azula's fire is blue, colder in temperature, more refined, the product of a level of control so precise that the instability she displays in the finale, the blue flickering into orange and back, is not just psychologically revealing but technically significant. The fire is losing its purity. She is losing the specific quality of mastery that set her apart from every other firebender in the nation. Where did the blue fire come from? It does not appear in Fire Nation history. The show gives no other blue firebender. Azula did not learn to produce it. It appears to be intrinsic to her, to the particular quality of her relationship to the element, which raises the possibility that she had a naturally purer connection to fire than the corrupted form the war had produced in most practitioners. That she had, buried under everything her father and her upbringing and her genius and her loneliness made of her, access to something closer to the original understanding of what fire is. The tragedy of that reading, if it is the right reading, is that the person with perhaps the most natural gift for understanding fire, in the way the Sun Warriors understood it, used that gift entirely in the service of the things that corrupt fire. What she might have been, in a different world, with a different father, is a question the show leaves hovering in the air behind every scene she is in. The surviving airbenders, or the question of their survival, is the mystery the show plants most deliberately and resolves most partially. Sozin's attack on the air nomads was simultaneous, comprehensive, comet amplified. The stated result is complete. There are no surviving air nomads. Aang is the last of his kind. And yet the show contains a figure named Guru Pathak, who greets Aang with the air nomad salute. Who knows the chakra traditions of the air nomads in the kind of depth that requires prolonged contact with the community, not merely historical study, who is clearly very old, who is described as a friend of the air nomads but not an airbender himself. his specific knowledge of air nomad spiritual traditions, his physical location in a place associated with airbender practices, the air nomad salute that he uses as a greeting, all of this points toward contact with the air nomad community that would have had to occur during the period when Aang was in the ice and the air nomads were supposed to be gone. The show never follows this up. The question of what happened in the immediate weeks and months after Sozin's attack, of whether there were communities or individuals who scattered and survived and kept the culture alive in hiding or in exile, is one of the great unanswered things in the Avatar mythology. It would be addressed in different and partial ways in the sequel and in the graphic novels. But the original series plants the question and leaves it growing. There is one more mystery the show carries quietly through all 3 seasons, so embedded in the structure of the storytelling that it almost does not read as a mystery at all. It is the question of what the Avatar cycle does to the people inside it. Aang knows Roku, not as a historical figure, not as someone he has studied, but as a presence, as someone whose memories he can access, whose voice he can hear, whose specific regrets and errors and accumulated wisdom he has inherited, along with everything else. The relationship between Aang and Roku in the show is warm and genuine and occasionally complicated, the way relationships between people who know each other's failures tend to be complicated. But the Avatar cycle contains more than Roku. It contains Kyoshi, who lived to be 226 years old, and whose tenure as Avatar was marked by a ruthlessness and a directness that are about as far from Aang's disposition as 2 people in the same body can manage. It contains Kuruk, who was charming and careless and paid the specific price that careless people pay when the universe presents them with a bill. It contains Yang Chen, whose multi-generational peace came from an understanding of spiritual politics so sophisticated that even the materials that have expanded her story struggle to fully map it. Each of these people lives in Aang, not as voices he hears constantly or personalities that compete for control of his hands, as tendencies, as instincts whose origins he cannot trace, as the sense that he has stood in a similar situation before and knows, without being able to say how he knows, which direction to move. The Avatar cycle does not give its carriers a clean inheritance. It gives them the accumulated complexity of every choice every previous Avatar ever made, including the wrong choices, including the choices that were made from exhaustion, or pride, or grief, or the specific blindness that comes from being too close to a situation to see it clearly. Aang's capacity for compassion is genuinely his own, but it has been shaped by 2,000 years of predecessors who found the limits of their compassion and passed those findings forward. His stubbornness about not killing is his own conviction, but it arrives in a lineage of avatars who made different calls about the same question and lived with the consequences. The mystery is not what the Avatar cycle is. The mystery is what it costs, and whether anyone has ever fully understood the nature of that cost and what it means to carry the memories of thousands of lives while trying to be one specific 12-year-old boy who wants to fly on his sky bison and eat dumplings and make his friends laugh. The show does not answer this question. It embeds it. It trusts you to feel the weight of it without requiring it to be articulated. Some things are left unresolved because the story ran out of time. Some things are left unresolved because the creators knew that a world with unanswered questions is a world you can keep returning to. A mystery that is solved is a door that closes. A mystery that persists is a door that stays open, and through it, the light of a world you love keeps reaching you across whatever distance you have put between yourself and the last time you sat inside it. And the world of Avatar has been giving people reasons to come back for 2 decades now. It will give them reasons for decades more. A final quiet thought before sleep. There is a thread that connects all of these mysteries, running beneath each of them the way groundwater runs beneath desert that shows no signs of being wet. Every one of them is about what survives when the forces that want things to end do their best work. And there is something worth sitting with, in the quiet of wherever you are right now, about what that means for the people who built the show and the people who have spent years coming back to it. The Avatar world was created by 2 people, Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino, who pitched it to Nickelodeon in 2002 and spent approximately 3 years developing it before a single episode aired. 3 years of building a world before showing it to anyone. 3 years of deciding where the spirit world ends and the mortal world begins. Of working out the philosophy behind each bending discipline. Of figuring out what the calligraphy on the scroll in a background shot in episode 9 needs to say, of determining what kind of music plays in the water tribe and what instruments produce that music, and why those instruments in particular belong to those people. 3 years of work that an audience of children would never know was happening, and that a careful adult rewatching 2 decades later would still be finding traces of. The show premiered in February 2005 to an audience of children aged roughly 6 to 11. It aired between SpongeBob SquarePants and The Fairly OddParents. The network slot could not have communicated less urgency about the importance of what it was carrying. And the creators put everything they had into it anyway. Not because the network demanded it, not because the audience was clamoring for a show about the philosophy of spiritual energy pathways and the ethics of water-based manipulation of biological tissue. They put it in because they believed the world they were building required it. Because the alternative, a world with a gap where the care should be, was not the world they were trying to make. Every one of these mysteries is about what survives. But the thing that makes them worth finding, tonight or any other night, is that their survival is not accidental. Someone chose for them to survive. Someone chose to hide them well enough that they would still be there on the 5th viewing, on the 20th, in the hands of people who are now adults and who came back looking for something they remembered feeling, without being able to name what produced the feeling. The feeling was produced by this, by 10,000 small decisions made with care, by 2 people and their team spending 3 years on a world that most people would watch once and enjoy and not think about again, building it as though the people who would think about it again and again and again deserve to find something new every time. They were right. Those people do deserve it. And every one of them is carrying, somewhere in the architecture of how they understand the world, a lesson they absorbed from a cartoon without knowing they were absorbing it. About patience. About what fire actually is. About the difference between a powerful face and the face behind the face. The one you keep still when something that collects faces is watching you. About what it means to sleep with your feet elevated when the ground is your vision and the night is long. The Avatar state survived in the ice for a century because it was needed, and things that are needed have a way of persisting beyond what circumstances seem to allow. The knowledge of bloodbending survived because human ingenuity finds expression in even the worst conditions. Because suffering and intelligence sometimes produce what the people who designed the suffering never considered. The library survived because knowledge written down is extremely difficult to permanently destroy, even when the person who owns it pulls it into another world entirely. The dragon survived because 2 people made the choice to protect something instead of claiming the credit for ending it. The Order of the White Lotus survived because genuine philosophical connection, once established between people who share it honestly, is more durable than any of the political structures that try to separate them. Iroh survived, completely changed, carrying a ghost he did not find and a wisdom he found in looking, because grief, when it goes all the way through, leaves a person with more capacity for understanding than they had before. Toph's blindness survived because it was never the limitation anyone thought it was. It was a different kind of seeing waiting for the right circumstances to show what it could do. And Sokka, who gets mentioned less in these kinds of conversations than the Benders do, survived all 3 seasons as the living proof that planning and humor and love are also forms of power, also capable of turning the course of battles, also worthy of a story. Every one of these is a version of the same story. Something that was supposed to be ended, or contained, or made powerless, or forgotten. Finding a way through, not through superior force, not through defiance that announces itself as defiance, through something quieter, more patient, more specifically suited to the nature of the thing being preserved. The Avatar state finding the ice, the knowledge seeking the moonlight, the library waiting in the spirit world, the dragon circling above a city that the world has forgotten. And Avatar Aang survived in a blue-lit iceberg for a century, sustained by the accumulated wisdom of every person who had ever carried his responsibility before him, waiting without knowing he was waiting, burning without knowing he was burning, until someone came rowing in the early Antarctic morning and looked at a light in the ice and decided to find out what was producing it. This is what the Avatar world is about, underneath everything else it is about. Not the specific bending techniques or the geopolitical conflicts or the decade-by-decade history of the 100-Year War. Not even the characters exactly, though the characters carry it. It is about what survives, about the things that are built carefully enough, loved specifically enough, held in memory with enough precision that the forces which want them gone cannot reach all the way to where they actually live. The calligraphy on the wanted posters, The seismic sense that finds earth in metal, the lotus tile at the center of the board, the sleeping position of a girl who sees with her feet, the blue fire that flickers in a cave at the edge of the world and does not go out. The world was built by people who believed that the thing you cannot see is just as important as the thing you can. That the detail no viewer will ever notice still needs to be right. That the sound of water bending differently when the bender is afraid, the specific way a scar catches light when the camera is on the wrong side of a boy's face, the color of fire when the person bending it is losing her mind, all of it matters. All of it contributes to the feeling of a world that is coherent and real and worth paying attention to. That is what these mysteries have been tonight. Not trivia, not Easter eggs buried for the dedicated to find. They are the places where the world's depth becomes visible, where the care that built it meets the attention of someone willing to look. And the thing about that kind of meeting is that it is mutual. The creators paid attention to the world they built. The world pays it back. It reveals itself in layers. It gives you something new every time you come back, because it was built with more inside it than any single visit can fully excavate. The Avatar world was designed to be felt rather than explained. The creators understood from the beginning that the most effective storytelling does not tell you what to feel. It builds the conditions under which feeling becomes the only available response. The calligraphy on the scrolls that you cannot read, the martial arts forms whose names you do not know, the sleeping position of a girl whose feet are her eyes, the face cycling through an ancient collection in a cave you cannot visit. All of these work on you below the level of language. All of them do their work in the same register that music works in, the register that bypasses the part of you that evaluates and goes directly to the part of you that receives. This is why you came back. Not for the facts exactly. For the feeling that the facts produce when you already love the world they belong to. For the sense of a world growing richer as you know it better, rather than simpler as the mystery resolves. For the particular satisfaction of finding something you did not know was there in a place you have been before. And for the particular quality of quiet that the show always offered, from its very first episodes, to people who needed a place to be still for a while. So let the voice go quiet. Let the room settle around you. Let the day, with all its specific weight and texture, release its hold on your shoulders. You have been in the Avatar world tonight. You have walked its hidden corridors, sat in its spirit library, stood at the edge of its oldest mysteries. You have been in a cave with something that wears the faces of the dead and watched someone hold perfectly still. You have felt the comet approach. You have sat in the Jasmine Dragon in the last warm hours of the war. The world is still there. It will be there when you wake up. It will have the same things in it, waiting patiently, because that is what good things do. They wait. In some corner of the spirit world, an old general is drinking tea, and the tea is exactly right. Somewhere in the deep ocean, something vast and ancient carries a forest on its back. In a cave at the edge of things, a collection cycles through its faces. And somewhere in the echo of an iceberg that cracked open on an Antarctic morning a very long time ago, the ghost of a blue light still vibrates in the crystal. Because some things, once kindled, do not go fully out. They just wait for someone to notice the glow. Sleep well. If you made it to the end, genuinely thank you for spending the night in this world. If the video gave you something good, leaving a like takes 1 second and it does actually matter for how the channel grows. If you want to be here for the next one, subscribing is free and means you will not miss it. See you in the quiet. The world is still there. The iceberg is still glowing. The library is still beneath the sand. The dragon is still circling above a city that the world has agreed to forget. Go find what you need in it. There is always more to find.